We just wait for Pranjal to come in, I think. We wait a moment. Okay, he's disconnected, but he'll connect again. Just let's wait for another minute, otherwise we'll start off.
Here we are.
Pranjal, you're back.
Yes, sorry.
So
Mr. Singhania, have you made your address?
No, waiting for you to come because you were a part of the address as well. So
Sure, please begin. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are now in our plenary session 9 of Coexisting with the Dragon, India's Security and Economic Conundrum. Mr. Nirupama Rao, former Foreign Secretary and Ambassador to India, Ambassador of India to China, USA. Mr. Claude, Smadja, the former Managing Director of World Economic Forum and Chairman, Smadja Strategic Advisory. Mr. Harry Broadman, Partner and Practice Chair, Berkeley Research Group LLC and Johns Hopkins University Faculty. Pranjal, Sharma, Economic Analyst, Advisor and Writer. We have had a couple of sessions already, as the delegates would know, on geopolitics, and therefore continuing with this theme, in this session we will discuss India's relations and ways to resolve economic and security issues between these two countries. We are privileged and honored to have a very high-powered panel with us, which is international, as indeed this technology is now providing. Nirupama ji, it is good to see you after a long time, and many thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
It will be very valuable to hear your perspective on the prevailing issues confronting India and China. And you were extensively involved in repairing, if I may say, India's relations with China during an earlier Rajiv Gandhi era. And you have been a China specialist in our Ministry of External Affairs. So it's great to have you, and we look forward to hearing you. Claude, it's always a pleasure to have you, and many thanks once again for joining us at AIMA's National Management Convention. You have been one of the architects in globalization for the past 3 decades, and you have been close and know both India and China. We look forward to hearing your views on what you think are the issues and what could be a way forward. You have been an old friend of AIMA, and it's great to have you back.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Pleasure. Mr. Broadman, it's always a pleasure to have you at the AIMA platform, and we appreciate that you've made the time for us and joined us today from another part of the world. You have explored competition between India and China in Africa, and you have written a book about it. And many thanks once again for joining us today. And Pranjal, it's always great to have you at AIMA. You have been with us on several occasions, and thank you for agreeing to moderate this session. Well, ladies and gentlemen, while India has friends around the world, it's having an issue, if I may say, in its neighborhood. In the past couple of decades, China has become bigger and richer, and is no longer shy of flexing its muscle. While a stronger and aspirational India does not want to accept China's hegemony, it must realize what its own strengths and weaknesses are. To have a conversation around it is now my pleasure to invite Pranjal Sharma, economic analyst, to conduct this panel session. Now, we need to have Pranjal back. That is one of the challenges of technology that we see. And if we don't have him in the next, I'm sure he'll join back through another internet connection. But if we don't have it, maybe we could just ask for opening statements from each of the panelists, brief opening statements from each of the panelists, by which time I think Pranjal will be back, and then we can have him ask you more strategic questions. Pranjal, all over to you now.
Thank you so much. I think it's the context has been laid out very well, even in the note which has been shared as part of the program. I'm going to request each of our speakers to give an opening statement for 2 to 3 minutes, and then we'll come to the key discussions. I think it's very fascinating that we're looking at the India-China problem. I would also like to see it as a problem. It's not about India having a China problem. Is it also that the world has a China problem? Because if you look at what's going on with China in Africa, China in Southeast Asia, China in Hong Kong, China in Europe, and of course China and US, it may not be about India, it may just be about China. But I'm going to request Ambassador Rao to begin.
Thank you, Pranjal, and thank you, AIMA, for inviting me onto this very distinguished panel to discuss a problem, an issue, a topic that I believe concerns, as Pranjal says, all of the world, not just India. As far as India is concerned, and I'd like obviously to confine my remarks to the India-China issue for this discussion this evening. India and China are, as you know, two neighbors. We share a long land border. In many ways, this is a continental space that runs across the spine of Asia, as first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru said many decades ago. Over the years, and Harshpati ji just referred to my association with China over the years, I had been associated, yes, with the revival of this relationship, particularly from the late 1980s onwards, when I worked on the China desk of the Ministry of External Affairs and had accompanied the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to China on a very historic, almost Nixon in China visit in December of 1988. And since that visit, we had built a structure, an operating system for this relationship that I believe had stood us in quite good stead over the years. First of all, we had been able to maintain peace and tranquility on this long land border of almost 3,500 kilometers. Not a single shot had been fired on that border, and there had been no violent incident. In fact, since the mid-1970s, and all that was, in a sense, terminated with the Galwan incident of June 15th this year. We had also, in this operating system, decided, the two countries, that despite the lack of resolution of the boundary problem between our two countries, we would still nonetheless go ahead and build a structure of relations that would focus on trade and economic interaction, leadership level summits, military to military relations, people to people ties, educational interaction, tourism, just to name a few of the sectors which had, in a sense, opened up from 1988 onwards. So this was a very different neighbor-to-neighbor relationship from the relationship that we have, as you know, with our Western neighbor, which is Pakistan, where stalemate has followed stalemate, and at the moment everything is back in the ice age, as it were, as far as India-Pakistan relationship is concerned. But what was the point of concern in our relations with China was that in the last 5 to 6 years, we had gradually begun to witness a fraying of this relationship, not just at the edges, but at the very core, as it were. We had a growing China-Pakistan relationship, understanding, harmonization in almost every sphere that was, yes, of concern to India, particularly because, for instance, with the launch of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, one of the flagship projects in BRI was the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which essentially ran through territory in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which is claimed by India. And that was really a thorn in the flesh as far as our bilateral relations with China were concerned. And as you know, India was the first country, in fact, to state its opposition to the BRI. We didn't participate in any of the BRI forums that China hosted from the beginning. And in a sense, we became a catalyst when once the whole all the pros and cons of the BRI were revealed, and the cons certainly outweighed the pros for most of the world. I think India's position was much better understood as far as the rest of Asia and the rest of the global stage was concerned. Apart from that, along the border that we shared, along the line of actual control that we and China share, we had seen increasing indications and evidence of heightened Chinese activity along the line of actual control, the LAC, as we define it. Lots of pockets where the Chinese had ingressed, and Galwan was essentially a paradigm, an example of that kind of activity. But across what we call the Indo-Pacific, and with the growth of closer relations between India and the United States, and much better understanding of China's rise, not just between us and the US, but with Japan, with countries like Australia, and even with some members of ASEAN. I think the extent and the proportions and the ramifications of China's rise, I think, came to be much better understood, and also a cause for concern across most of the region. I'm not saying that what has happened at Galwan and what is currently happening in terms of tensions along the border with China, as far as India is concerned, would spell the death of engagement between India and China. But what I'd like to say is, even if it does not spell the death of engagement, we would like to resolve these problems peacefully and through negotiation. But public opinion in India has turned against China. There has been an erosion of trust between the two countries. And all in all, I believe that a lot of what we have defined as far as this relationship is concerned has to be restructured, has to be reconceptualized. And the future seems, I'm sad to say, quite uncertain. I'll stop here and let the other speakers take on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rao. I think erosion of trust is the key defining phrase. There was the optimism at some point that two Asian giants can rise peacefully in a coexistence and have coexistence which does not hurt the other. China's rise in a peaceful way as a global economic power is much lauded. But the question then is, what do you do with that power and how do you wield that power? I'm coming now to Claude for his opening remarks and set the context from his perspective sitting in Europe.
Thank you, Pranjal. Let me try to make 3 points as opening remarks. Number one, China will not renounce its relationship with Pakistan, which is a strategic relationship, and it will not renounce the Belt and Road Initiative, which is also a strategic signature initiative of President Xi Jinping. On the other side, India will not renounce its belonging to the Quad, and it will not renounce seeking closer ties with the US. It means that what has been tried before, which is to separate the policy and security issues from the trade, economic, business relationship, is today more crucial than ever. And of course, the Galwan incident and all these elements have created a very emotional situation in India. But foreign policy cannot be dictated just by emotional reactions. I think the first priority should be to de-escalate the emotions and get back to the effort to separate politics from trade, economic, business relationship. In that respect, I think that the economic measures taken by the government in India, although one can understand why they have been taken, are in fact detrimental to India as well as they are detrimental to China. So, in this kind of game, there are no winners, there are only losers. Point number two, it is quite clear that China is now asserting its ambitions as a power now who can claim status and role as a great power. President Xi Jinping made it very clear in 2017 when he said, China has stood up, grown rich, and become strong, and is moving toward center stage. The buzz phrase sentence that you hear in China is China's objective to get very close to center stage. And let us face it, China will emerge much stronger than the US from this crisis. The trend, as we see them already emerging, is that China will be emerging much stronger from the crisis. The US will emerge much weaker than from the crisis, and Europe will emerge even more weaker than the US from the crisis. So we need to take account realities, and these are the realities. But also another reality is that what China is doing today, although there are some very unpleasant aspects in it, is what every single emerging great power has done. Look at the history and look at the rise of the British Empire and look at the behavior of the US over the last 75 years, where the US has been asserting its will on the rest of the world, using trade sanction, using military action whenever it saw fit. This is the reality of great power, and please forgive me, but I am an old realpolitik hand. So, in this condition, the crisis has highlighted even more a very painful situation, which is the economic gap which has widened between China and India. In 1993, the per capita income in India and China was almost equal, the same, about $380 per capita. Today, the per capita income in China is 5 times larger than the per capita income in India. China's military power is much greater than India's military power. And you get back to this notion which emerged during the Clinton presidential race when one of his top aides said, it is the economy, stupid. If India wants to deal in a better way with China, the economy, the growth of economy in India should be the one and only absolute priority. But India has let the gap widen and not shrink. And so in the medium and long term, the key solution for having a much more balanced relationship is for India to accelerate the closing of the gap. Point number 3. The border issue between India and China is a very tricky one. There is not even a border. It is called the line of actual control. And so at the moment, the key issue is for the two parties to avoid and recoil from any infrastructure buildup that might worry the other side, whether it is China or whether it is India. At the moment, the agreement reached by Minister Jay Shankar and Minister Wang has been a very promising first step. The key issue is how do you move ahead and build up on this first step so that you create really a freeze in the present situation so that this thing, this line of control issue, line of act becomes something that can be put on the back burner until the situation between the two countries improve, and then discussions, negotiation, whatever, can try to start on a situation which is a little bit more cleared from emotional reactions. I would stop here for the moment.
Thank you, Claude. You know, the point about Pakistan is interesting because Pakistan has been used by different powers against India over the last few decades, whether it's US or Russia or UK, of course, to begin with. Pakistan has always been a tool in the hands of those who don't want, who have a problem with India. So I would say that, you know, China is just following in the footsteps of other economic powers, and that's again the fascinating piece, referring to what I said earlier. When you rise and you are an economic global power, what do you do with that power? Do you use it wisely, or do you use it to again repeat the mistakes of earlier colonial powers? And it appears to a lot of people that China is trying to be the new economic global power across the country, simply because it does not believe in an equal relationship. And from all perspectives, what you can see, either there are two types of relationships it enjoys. Either it is dominating another country or it's trying to dominate the other country. So I think from that perspective, China has created a perception that it's a body to be feared, not perhaps respected. But let me bring in Harry here and get his perspective, because as we've seen in the last year or so, the way President Trump has taken on China, for better or for worse. Claude, do you think that US will be the worse for it? But let's get in Harry's point of view.
Thank you very much. I want to make 4 points that really focus on the economic and business competition, if you will, between India and China. And I liken the race between them as the race between the tortoise and the hare. China has been running very fast. India has been more deliberate in its economic championship. But I think in the end, the tortoise may well beat out the hare. Now, I've got 4 points along these lines that I just want to lay on the table here. Number one, China is in a secular slowdown of its economy. In other words, let's not focus on the cyclical changes, but on the secular changes. Its GDP growth has begun to decline over the last 10 years, and that's for a very particular reason. It's not because China is a mature economy and is getting old in terms of how long it's been an economic power. It's slowing down secularly because the Communist Party is continuing to strangle competition within the economy with the domination of state-owned enterprises and the nexus between the state-owned enterprises and the state-owned banks, where frankly, the banks pretend to lend money to the state-owned enterprises and the state-owned enterprises pretend to pay it back. And if you look at the non-performing loans on the bank's balance sheets, the numbers speak for themselves. Now, India has been highly variable in its growth rate, but it has begun to show, I think, with proper policies, that it can actually grow quite fast. Certainly in this decade, that record is clear. I think the challenge for India in its race with respect to China is to continue to open up the economy, let markets dictate prices, but at the same time making sure that there's infrastructure built and making sure that the remaining poverty in India is alleviated with proper policies. One area, second point, is the competition that takes place worldwide between Chinese enterprises and Indian enterprises. And I've done a lot of work on this matter. What you see is the state-owned enterprises in China, do a very good job in terms of outcompeting other firms, but they do so because they're heavily subsidized, as I mentioned before, not just because of loans, but outright subsidies from the government. In the end, while it has been paying off for the Chinese in the short term, in the end, I think Indian firms, which tend to be more privately oriented, less government intrusion in terms of ownership, will outcompete China. But as I say, going back to this tortoise and the hare analogy, India has got to continue to be steady in terms of allowing its enterprises overseas to outcompete China. And it has been doing so when you look at the data, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Europe, and whether it's in Africa and Latin America. The third point I want to make is the sign of a healthy economy and a rapidly growing economy for the long run is how much foreign investors want to invest in the economies. And the numbers are quite striking when you compare the amount of foreign direct investment that has been going into China per GDP and the amount of foreign direct investment that has been going in India per GDP. If you go back to the 1990s, the FDI to GDP ratio for China was about 6%. It has been on a downward trend ever since, and last year, in 2019, that number was 1.1%. That's telling you how investors think about China. And it's telling you also about the policy framework that China has in place to attract foreign direct investment. The new foreign investment law in China, which took about 5 years to revise, is way below world-class standards in terms of treating foreign investors in a like-minded way as it does domestic investors. So there's a lot of policy and legal aspects to China's decline in the foreign direct investment to GDP ratio. With respect to India, it has started from a much lower ratio in the early 1990s, roughly less than 1%. For 2019, it was up to 1.1%. So you've got a downward trajectory in terms of FDI to GDP in China, and an upward trajectory, though more variable, in the case of India. That is an extraordinarily important point, I think, when we're looking at comparing India and China and what the policymakers in India need to focus on in terms of opening up the economy to foreign direct investment. The recent government has been making the right kinds of policy calls, but in my view, not enough. And if you want to win the race against China, we need to allow more foreign direct investment to come in to India. The fourth point I want to make is with respect to this Belt and Road Initiative that we're all fascinated with. Now, it's a very clever experiment, maybe even a plan on the part of the Chinese, but at its root, it is not an altruistic objective that China is following. The problem is, as I noted in my point number one, is because there are state-owned enterprises that dominate the economy of China, there's excess capacity. There's not enough people who want to buy internally in China the goods and the employees who are working at these big, large state-owned enterprises. So what the Belt Road Initiative really represents at its fundamental is exporting that excess capacity to neighboring countries around the world. And we can go through those country by country, and as you'll see, increasingly recipients of the countries for the Belt and Road Initiative investments are beginning to question whether or not it's actually in their best interest. But most importantly, when you're looking at the Belt Road Initiative on the part of China, it actually flies in the face of how China has done extraordinarily well over time in getting growth out of the economy as much as it can under a communist leadership. And that way that the Chinese have engaged in reforms has been through experimentation and incremental reforms, testing what works, what doesn't work. The case of the Belt Road Initiative is not experimental, it's not incremental, it's a one fell swoop, uniform plan across the economies that the Belt Road Initiative is being wheeled out to. And I think that will be perhaps where China, the Belt Road Initiative, will maybe become a bridge that's too far. So I think the two economies are in a race. I think there are great differences between the two of them. I think China is frankly on a downward trend, and I think it's up to India to embrace the kinds of policies that allow it to outcompete China, not just internally, domestically in the markets, but in third country markets, where I think India's firms are far more competitive with other global firms than Chinese firms. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. I think Belt and Road Initiative is clearly an important milestone. And if you remember, India's refusal to be part of it was seen by many as a turning point, where China started feeling that India is not going to be controlled in the way that they would like it to be. In the same way, as you said, they're trying, as the countries which have received their munificence are realizing that it's not really a boon, it's really a bane. I'd like to come to Ambassador Rao, and we've got a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to synthesize some of them. Would you say, Ambassador Rao, that today China is stretched too thin? It has a problem with India on the border, it has a problem on Hong Kong, and therefore it has a problem with United Kingdom. Of course, the South China Sea continues to fester, and you know about the reports of jets flying over Taiwan. Then, of course, you have the problem where they're trying to stoke up problems in Africa. So, and not to mention the US issue with the issues around technological sovereignty, spying, and control that we see. Do you think that today China is its ambition is going ahead of its ability to really manage its growth?
Well, I'd like to focus on the ambition factor and the very assertive face of China that you see both in our region and globally. Is China stretching itself too thin? I think I wouldn't be able to give you an unequivocal yes to that question you've asked. I think it's still too early to say that. But the fact is that China's aggressive nationalism, its so-called striving for achievement, as Xi Jinping calls it, has really ratcheted up concern across the world. But I am focused on India and the problem that we have with China, and what the implications of this aggressive nationalism, this overzealous attitude that you see of China, is going to on our country and for our region. So again, as an answer to your question, one obviously sees the reality that there's a very different face of China that is visible to all of us. It may have been in evidence for some years now, I would say at least a decade, when issues of territorial sovereignty and issues of border differences with neighbors, both in the maritime domain and across the continental land space, became more and more evident. And that, coupled with China's economic strength, its military wherewithal, all that makes for a very rapacious image that you see of China today.
Mr. Rao, I'd like to stay with you on this point. As a top diplomat of India, do you think it's time from an Indian perspective to start picking up issues which really rankle China? So far, we've been on the receiving end. We've been more reactive rather than proactive. So the Tibet issue, should we get aggressive on that? The Taiwan issue, should India now go ahead and establish full diplomatic relationship with Taiwan? I think we've done some good work in Sri Lanka and Maldives. It's not really over yet. But if you look at what's going on in South China Sea, should India now go on the front foot? Should it now become more aggressive and say that, well, we can play the same game of being extra assertive on issues that bother them, because they've been very assertive on issues that bother us?
Look, I think we need to focus on how we must build equilibrium in order to handle the threat from China. In my view, diplomatically, it's not a question of ticking boxes like Tibet or Taiwan or Hong Kong or South China Sea. On all these issues, we may have a position, and this is a position that we should be able to share with like-minded partners and the democratic friends that we have, the democracies that we have in the region and with the United States. I think what you will see gradually is more of an inclination showed up by public opinion in India within the democratic space that India must be a little stronger and a little more clear about its policy on the issues that you mentioned, whether it's Tibet or whether it's Taiwan, to just mention two. But let me also remind you that on Tibet, for instance, the window closed in the mid-50s where we recognized Tibet as a region of China. We didn't even talk, in fact, of autonomy at that time. So reopening a lot of this is not, it's not a question, it's not an open shut sort of issue. I think what India needs to do, when we talk of strategic autonomy, every country needs that, no doubt, strategic autonomy, politically, militarily, economically, what have you. I think what India needs to do is to build, as a lot of experts have said, issue-based coalitions with like-minded countries. And the Quad is one of them. But what we do with ASEAN, what we do with the East Asian friends and partners like Japan and South Korea, the dialogue that we're building up with Australia, the supply chain resilience initiatives that we are now talking of. What do we do in the technology domain, since we have decided to rule out Huawei as far as 5G networks in India are concerned? So everything is today very fluid, and we need to build that flexible geometry of relationships and coalitions that can sustain us at this period of, it's a near crisis situation that we face with COVID, with, the way the economy is doing, and with the situation facing China. So we have to be realistic about it, and we should look before we leap. As they say in Latin, festina lente, hasten slowly.
Thank you, Mazarov. Claude, I'll come to you. And, you talked about important issues in terms of the economic gap also increasing. But look at it this way. We are comparing China with India, but look at the comparison. China doesn't have an open civil society. It does not have free press. It does not have free enterprise. It has a digital wall, which means that European and American digital technology companies cannot enter, while they demand entry into all open civil society, free market democracies. At the same time, there are people in Europe and US who still feel that it's okay to do business with China because if there's profit, it's perfectly fine. Every other problem is excused. Every other mistake is excused. We are not even getting into issues of human rights, which we see coming out of China. Isn't it time then for countries which are open free market democracies to stand up and work together and ensure and establish the fact that that is the right path ahead, rather than saying that the China model is better than the India model?
I don't think it is a question of saying one model is better than the other model. The Chinese have their own model. We have our own model. The Chinese don't pretend to change our model. They have their own model. What we should be looking for in terms of economic, business, investment policy is more reciprocity, which is getting more, I would say, punctilious when dealing with China, to insist and take measures when needed to have reciprocity. But whether it is a closed or open society, I consider that this is their business. It is not our business. Because after all, when we deal with Saudi Arabia, when we deal with regimes which have a dismal human rights record, we are not looking too much at the way they run their country. So I think we should stop with this notion that our role is, or our mission is to spread democracy all over the world. This is one point which is very important. The second point, which is very important, is whether we like it or not, the market for many key elements is in China. Harry was mentioning foreign investment. In 2019, foreign investment in China was $136 billion. In India, it was $51 billion. 80% of American companies surveyed by the American Chamber of Commerce, 80% of them have, and this is an anonymous survey, have explained that they have no plans whatsoever to move from China. And the 20% who have plans to move entirely or in part from China, where do they want to go? They want to go to Vietnam, which is the same kind of regimes than China. They want to go to Indonesia, to Mexico, and only 6% want to relocate in the US. So I think these are elements we should be dealing with and not wishful thinking. Now, the question that we have is that until very recently, it is true that the promises and the realities, let us not forget that for some key American companies, the majority of their profits come from China. They don't come from the US, they don't come from Europe, they don't come from India, they come from China. So we need today to have a situation where, to some extent, we find ways to create more reciprocity. A key point in that respect is that WTO has become completely obsolete. The WTO rules were established before China joined, and it was crazy to think that China, a country of this size, will just slip seamlessly into the structure of WTO. It is like me if I take all of a sudden 50 kilos and I would expect to go into the same suit than I had before. So the question today is, how do we sit and review the rules of WTO so that we create a structure for international trade which can accommodate two blocks of more or less equal economic weight with different systems, with different logics of operation, so that we create a system where these two blocks can coexist and interact in a way that will be positive for the two blocks. So these are rather the challenges that I see today. This is the same with respect to the IMF. This is the same with respect to the World Bank. And in that respect, for instance, India is in the same situation than China. Why on earth should Europe and the US share as a kind of hunting ground the top position at the IMF and the World Bank? So these are the kind of questions where today we need to review an architecture which is not anymore adapted to the new realities of the world balance in terms of economic weight and power in the world, and also the emergence of countries not only of China, but also of India, because India has also some key problems with the existing structures.
That's right, Claude. I think the emergence and the need to recognize a multipolar world hasn't really settled into the consciousness of all the global leaders yet. But you refer to multilateral organizations, and I want to come to Harry on that Adi, I think what is common between the Indian approach and the US approach on China is to reduce that huge dependence on certain critical supplies, whether it's pharmaceutical ingredients or other technological inputs. To that extent, do you think it is sensible now for India and US to do what they are doing, which is India is talking about self-reliance, and US President Trump is also talking about the fact that we need to be able to make important things ourselves, and this emergence of huge dependence, which can be leveraged against the country. See, we're not in a open trading world where it doesn't really matter whether you're highly dependent or not, but that power, if it's wielded in an improper way, it could create a problem. It could, sour relations, and that's what you're seeing in the trade war that was triggered off last year. Do you think that's the right approach to deal with China in terms of challenging them and building own domestic capacities?
Well, it may be a wish on the part of Mr. Trump, but it's not going to fly, largely because the mature economies and the fastest growing economies are services oriented, not manufacturing oriented. So the notion of trying to become a manufacturing giant is pretty old school. But more importantly, I think this notion that Mr. Trump has of trying to, quote, decouple, unquote, from China is also fanciful. And I think the survey results, for instance, that Claude just mentioned, although they're perceptions, they're not decisions that the firms are making, they're showing that it's much harder to have enforced firms to move out of China back to the US. In fact, most firms in China, if they're going to go anywhere, are not going to come back home. They're going to go to the ASEAN. They're going to go to other countries that have very large markets, that have lower labor costs, but that also actually are a trade area that works quite well and is much more free market oriented. So I think it's quite fanciful for both policy purposes and for business oriented purposes that decoupling is going to make its way in the way that Mr. Trump would like. But I think thirdly, and the ambassador mentioned this, supply chains now are far more complex and rigid than they have been in the past. And so it's not so easy to just pick up and move your supply chain. But one thing that has happened, and the COVID crisis has made this very clear, is that supply chains now have an incentive to become much more diversified and much more flexible. And if you think of supply chain management as an insurance mechanism, what we are beginning to see, at least in the firms with whom I work, that they are beginning to build in redundancies in their supply chains around the world because they were very scared about what happened during the COVID crisis when China went offline. They had not fully realized, at least in the upper echelons of many of these companies, in the boardrooms and the C-suite, just how dependent and how rigid their supply chains were with respect to China. And so what you're beginning to see is searching for other and creating other capacities overseas to feed their supply chains. But the notion that the supply chains are now going to pick up and move to the United States, I think is just not, it's just not commercially reasonable. But the fifth point I would make is that what's happening with respect to supply chains, which also undercuts this decoupling notion, is supply chains, the logistics behind them are become digitalized. And this is making for much more flexible supply chains. It's making them much more economic. That means that there's going to be less labor involved. Many of the most modern supply chains today are, have relatively few humans involved in terms of loading ships and unloading ships and the like. In fact, it's the last mile of the supply chains where we are seeing great human interaction. Now, maybe over time that will change if we see drones delivering the last mile. But I think, the notion that we can just pull out of China and move someplace else, and in particular, if Mr. Trump's wishes are to become true, back to the US, I think is really quite fanciful. And then the last point I would just make, and I really do want to respond to what Claude said about the WTO. I don't think the WTO is obsolete. I don't think the rules need to be changed. I think the problem is that the WTO has not been utilized well, particularly by the largest trading partners. Mr. Trump has basically given up on the WTO. He's basically put a kibosh on the dispute panels, and more importantly, he's tried to take on China, which should be taken on. He's tried to take on China bilaterally outside of the WTO. And that's the problem, because many trading partners have a beef, pardon the pun, with China and its trading rules, but they have yet to bring a case before the WTO, and the United States has thwarted this issue, bring a case before the WTO that China is in broad violation of its 2001 accession agreement. It has not put in place the reforms under that agreement that it promised to do. Meanwhile, the WTO parties, particularly the biggest trading partners, have not been willing to take on China. And they're not willing to take on China for a whole set of reasons, because their businesses don't want them to. But this is what separates, if pardon the pun, the men from the boys. That if the WTO is to be used, I don't think it needs to be changed, it just needs to be used. That's how we deal with China. And that's how we put in more flexibility and resiliency in supply chains and get growth going in the world economy again following the pandemic.
Right, thanks, Harry. I'll just stay on this point on supply chain, because that's a critical point you made earlier. In January, in the pre-COVID era, I would say, I was at a session and spoke with, which had Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross and a couple of global leaders of logistics companies. And even then, owing to sustainability issues and SDG goals, the conversation was about how there's going to be intra-region supply chains and trade. So rather than taking something from China to South America and vice versa, you would be within South America or within Asia or within the Americas. And that was the conversation coming along, because they said that there is a need, even if we don't look at geopolitical issues from a sustainability point of view, to reduce the carbon footprint by being closer to the making sure that the products where they're made and where they're sold are as close to each other as possible. So would you say that COVID will accelerate that? And this the US-China, India-China issue will accelerate it?
Absolutely. The evidence is already in that there's greater diversification in supply chain management. It may not be necessarily one region over another, but the notion of having greater agility in supply chains is definitely here to stay. And COVID has accelerated that, first and foremost, because of the economic recession that is put in place. People are getting very concerned about it. But as I say, the social distancing rules that come about from the COVID pandemic mean that there has to be more socially distanced in the workplace. But that is only accelerating digitalization of supply chains. But I do think that it's really important to understand, which I think a lot of C-suites and boards around the world did not fully appreciate, lower level management did. But supply chains today, it's not just a question of producing a product to China and then coming to the United States. Supply chains are tiered. So when you see a product coming into India or coming into the United States that's labeled made in China, absolutely what is going on is a lot of these products, a certain component may well have been made in China, but then it's shipped to Thailand, where another component is bolted on. And then maybe it's shipped to Brazil, where a third component is bolted on. And then it comes to India, or then it comes to the United States. So the notion that supply chains are these sort of bilateral, linear relationships is just not true. That's not the way the world is working. So I think the name of the game that has been underway now for the last several months and will continue, because people got very spooked about the over-reliance on one locale, China, is to diversify those supply chains.
Pranjal, can I make 2 points very quickly?
Absolutely. So there are 2 minutes left. So Claude, I'd like to give you 1 minute, and then Ambassador Rao 1 minute.
Okay, first of all, WTO, even the top people at WTO will recognize privately that many things at WTO don't work because the economy has changed, the rules of the game have exchange. So it is not just a question of not using WTO. The second point, so it needs complete review of what it is and the way it operates. Point number two, in this diversification, and I'm in full agreement with Harry, in this diversification, India has a card to play. India has a very important card to play.
Yep.
But to be able to play that card successfully, it means two things: accelerating the effort on infrastructure building,
Yep.
on one hand, and accelerating the effort to broaden the industrial base of a country. Because again, supply chain is not one or two elements, it is relationship, it is components upstream and downstreams, it is a number of things. And India needs to put its effort in building that so that it becomes a real important player in that.
Thank you, Claude. And the closing remarks by you, Ambassador Rao, that do you think economic strength is really the way out for India to take on China? You're on mute, ma'am.
Definitely, Pranjal, economic strength holds the key to a strong, resilient, prosperous future for India, not just vis-a-vis China. Everything shouldn't be just seen as that problem, the problem that we see with China. It's a question of our building strength when we look to the future, our becoming a power on the global stage. We always talk of becoming a leading power. We have all the potential for that. Maybe this is a wake-up call for us to look at how ease of doing business in India should be improved, how we can introduce better, deeper structural reforms as far as the economy is concerned, how we can integrate ourselves more closely with the rest of the world, while at the same time building what the Prime Minister calls self-reliance. You know, there are so many things that we need to do on the economic and trade front after what has happened and is happening with China. But let's also remember that even as China grows in strength, it doesn't have that kind of discourse power, let's say, that the United States has. The United States has much more than that. But even India, I believe, has a great deal of discourse power in the world as the world's largest democracy. For all the responsibility, the sense of responsibility that it conveys when it comes to managing and dealing with global problems, which I believe China does not bring to the table as yet. So, you know, the balance, you look at you know, what we have to do, and on the other hand, what we have already done, which places us in a better position vis-a-vis China. So let's take heart from that also. I think we need to move forward with a much greater sense of self-confidence. Nothing is lost. We need to continue our dialogue with China to de-escalate and disengage and create an atmosphere of more peace and tranquility in the border areas, while at the same time understanding that this is an inflection point for us in our present history. And let's look at that from that point of view in a very clinical, very objective, very realistic way.
Thank you, Ambassador Rao. That's a wonderful summary. I'll just add that the crisis of China and COVID is going to impact India deeply for many decades to come. And hopefully the impact will be a positive and a constructive change. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us from 3 different continents. And now I'd like to hand it back over to Rekha at AIMA.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.